I discovered my mother. Spent $300. $300. Bribing psychiatrists to declare me insane, while planning to steal the multi-million-dollar inheritance my father left me. I discovered the manila envelope hidden behind the cookbooks in my mother's kitchen on a stifling January afternoon when the suffocating heat of the American summer transformed the air into a dense, unbreathable mass that seemed to exponentially amplify the feeling of claustrophobia that had been following me for months in that house, which had once been synonymous with safety, comfort, and unconditional love, but was now progressively revealing itself as the meticulously prepared setting for a betrayal so profound, so calculated, so absolutely contrary to any natural maternal instinct that it challenged not only my personal conception of the sacred bonds between mother and daughter, but the entire social, cultural, and even biological construction of what it means to conceive, nurture, and protect a life that emerged from one's own womb. The digital clock on the imported microwave that Helen had bought with my father's corporate credit card showed exactly 4:23 in the afternoon, a time that would be forever engraved in my memory with the surgical precision of a scalpel cutting through layer after layer of family illusion, carefully constructed over decades, as the exact moment, the precise instant, the definitive second when I discovered that my own mother, the woman who had carried me in her womb for 9 months of pregnancy, who had endured the pain of childbirth to bring me into the world, who had nursed me in my first months of life, creating the most primitive and sacred bond between two human beings, had systematically, methodically, and with psychopathic coldness orchestrated an elaborate medical conspiracy with military precision to declare me mentally incompetent before the American justice system and assume total and unrestricted control of the multi-million-dollar inheritance that my father, in his premonitory wisdom that I now understood had been based on founded suspicions, had left exclusively in my name through an ironclad will with specific clauses before suddenly dying of a massive heart attack 5 years earlier on an apparently ordinary Monday morning. The envelope, yellowed by time and the characteristic humidity of American kitchens, where the constant steam from boiling pots impregnates every surface with its ghostly and indelible presence, was strategically positioned behind a row of cookbooks that Helen obsessively collected but rarely consulted, hardcover volumes on French cuisine that she pretended to master at social dinners, compilations of regional American dishes that she claimed had been passed down through generations in the family but had actually been copied from the internet, handwritten notebooks with careful lettering that supposedly contained my grandmother's culinary secrets, but which I discovered were transcriptions from television shows. It was while searching for a specific orange cake recipe that my paternal grandmother had actually taught me before she died, in a desperate attempt to connect with genuine memories of family love uncontaminated by the toxicity of the present, that my hand brushed against the thick envelope that was carefully folded and hidden like a shameful secret that should never see the light of day. The rough texture of the manila paper under my fingers was the first physical clue that I was about to discover something monumentally significant. There was a density, a weight to that envelope that transcended its physical properties, as if the universe itself was trying to alert me through touch that the contents of that package would irrevocably change my understanding of who my mother was, who I was, and what the true nature of the relationship I believed I had with the person who should be my greatest protector in the world. The envelope contained documents that revealed a conspiracy so elaborate, so meticulously planned, so professionally executed, that for moments I wondered if I was living a particularly vivid nightmare, or if I had inadvertently crossed into a parallel reality where mothers systematically destroy daughters for financial gain. There were contracts signed with signatures notarized by notaries who probably had no idea they were legitimizing documents that would serve for one of the greatest imaginable family betrayals. Receipts for substantial payments totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, methodically transferred over 3 years through bank accounts that I didn't know Helen maintained at different banks to make tracking difficult. Proof of electronic transfers always made at specific times, usually during my business trips when she knew I would be distracted with engineering projects. And most importantly, what froze my blood in my veins, as if the tropical January had suddenly transformed into a Siberian winter, detailed transcripts of completely fabricated therapy sessions, where supposed mental health professionals with impressive credentials and specific specialties described with rich technical detail serious, progressive, and deteriorating psychiatric symptoms that I had never presented at any point in my adult or childhood life. These fraudulent medical documents were masterpieces of psychiatric fiction, creating a medical dossier so convincing in its technical elaboration, so filled with specialized jargon and references to diagnostic manuals, so meticulously constructed with plausible temporal progression that it could easily convince any judge, doctor, or legal authority that I urgently needed to be involuntarily committed to any high-security psychiatric institution or have my legal guardianship summarily declared without me having the slightest chance of defense, since any protest from me would be interpreted as yet another manifestation of the psychotic symptoms described in the reports. The transcripts described manic episodes that never occurred, citing specific dates where I had supposedly demonstrated erratic and dangerous behavior, when in reality I was working normally in my office with dozens of witnesses. They reported complex auditory and visual hallucinations that I had allegedly confessed during sessions that never happened, in offices where I had never set foot, with professionals I had never met personally. They documented a progressive cognitive deterioration that completely contradicted my impeccable professional performance as a civil engineer responsible for multi-million-dollar urban infrastructure projects that required mathematical precision and absolute mental clarity. My hands trembled violently like sheets of paper in the wind of a tropical storm as I read each document with the obsessive and desperate attention of someone deciphering their own civil death sentence. Each report fabricated with Machiavellian precision that transformed my demonstrably solid mental sanity into an elaborate medical fiction with so many technical details, so many specific psychiatric terms, so many references to pathological behaviors, that even I, for brief and terrifying moments of existential doubt, wondered if perhaps there was some truth in those descriptions of psychotic episodes with paranoid features, dissociative episodes with severe depersonalization, and delusions of grandeur alternating with suicidal ideation that had never even tangentially crossed the territory of my conscious or subconscious mind. Each page I turned revealed new levels of betrayal, new depths of deception, new abysses of calculated cruelty. There were reports describing fictional psychiatric hospitalizations in luxury clinics, where I had supposedly been treated under a pseudonym to protect my professional privacy, prescriptions for high-potency antipsychotic medications that I had never taken but that appeared to have been regularly filled at specific pharmacies, falsified neurological exam results indicating brain abnormalities that would justify erratic behavior and progressive loss of judgment capacity. The bank transfer receipts were especially revealing and devastating in their numerical coldness that left no room for alternative interpretations or benevolent justifications. Helen, my own 62-year-old mother with her face always impeccably made up with expensive imported products, and her blonde hair religiously dyed every 3 weeks at the most exclusive salon in the upscale neighborhood where she maintained an apartment I didn't know existed, had methodically invested more than $300,000 during the last 3 years, an amount that could buy a comfortable middle-class house, guarantee a peaceful retirement for an entire family, or finance the complete university education of several underprivileged children, to systematically build, brick by brick of medical lies, document by fraudulent document, an elaborate and convincing narrative of progressive madness around me that would be my invisible but inescapable psychiatric prison. The payments were structured to avoid suspicion, broken amounts, transfers on apparently random dates, but which I later realized coincided with my travel periods, always below the limit that would require notification to financial control agencies. There was also evidence of cash payments, meetings in shopping mall parking lots, documented through informal handwritten receipts, and even indications of payments through third parties to add more layers of obscurity to the criminal scheme. The physical and visceral sensation of that devastating discovery was as if every internal organ in my body had been simultaneously removed and replaced with molten lead, heavy and poisonous, corroding me from the inside with emotional acid while I desperately struggled to maintain some appearance of external composure. Even being completely alone in that kitchen that still exhaled the comforting but now ironically cruel aroma of the garlic and onion sauté from lunch that Helen had prepared with her own hands a few hours earlier, humming old melodies while chopping seasonings with the same calculated precision with which she had planned my psychiatric destruction. The contrast between the familiar domestic environment, the polished aluminum pots that distortedly reflected my shocked face, the dish towels embroidered with tropical fruit motifs that my grandmother had made decades ago with genuine love, the traditional clay water filter sweating condensation droplets in the suffocating afternoon humidity, the refrigerator magnets from places we had visited as a family in more innocent times, and the monstrous magnitude of the betrayal I had just discovered created a cognitive dissonance so profound that I felt temporarily dissociated from reality, as if I were floating above my own body watching a stranger discover that her entire life had been an elaborate lie. The discovery of those damn documents was like being struck simultaneously by 1,000 lightning bolts in broad daylight. Sudden, devastating, completely unexpected, and impossible to process in its entirety at the moment of impact. An electrical discharge of brutal realization that traveled through every nerve ending in my body, with the speed of light, and the combined force of all the tropical storms that had ever ravaged the American coast, leaving in its wake only emotional scorched earth and the urgent need to completely rebuild my understanding of maternal love, family trust, and the very nature of blood bonds. Although now, looking retrospectively through the lens of understanding painfully acquired at the cost of my innocence about fundamental human goodness, all the warning signs had been clearly visible like red beacons flashing frantically during years of subtle but constant psychological manipulation that I had misinterpreted. With the desperate naivety of a daughter who still believed in the myth of unconditional maternal love, as excessive but well-intentioned concern from a widowed mother trying to protect her only daughter in an increasingly cruel and competitive world. Throughout my adult life, since graduating with distinction and honors in civil engineering from the State University 15 years ago in a ceremony where Helen cried tears that I now suspect were of frustration at my success rather than maternal pride, I methodically built a solid, respected, and financially rewarding career as a civil engineer specializing in large urban infrastructure projects that transform the chaos of American metropolises into more livable spaces. Elegant and functional bridges that connected communities previously separated by mighty rivers or impassable urban voids, strategically positioned overpasses that relieved the hellish traffic of rush hours, sophisticated drainage systems that protected entire neighborhoods from devastating floods that previously destroyed lives and property every rainy season, subway stations that brought dignity and mobility to suburbs forgotten by public authorities. I always maintained, with almost military discipline inherited from my father, my mental health in perfect balance through a rigorous but enjoyable routine of regular physical exercise in the still, cool mornings before the tropical heat settled like a suffocating blanket over the city, running through tree-lined parks as the sun rose, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Practicing yoga in silent studios where the only sound was the synchronized breathing of practitioners. My diet had always been consciously healthy, rich in organic fruits and vegetables that I carefully selected myself at the Saturday farmers market, knowing each producer by name, knowing exactly where each food that entered my body as fuel for a productive and balanced life came from. I practiced 20 minutes of daily meditation religiously for years, a technique I had learned in a 10-day silent retreat in the Colorado mountains where the only commitment was to be present with oneself, observe thoughts without judgment, find peace in inner silence that counterbalanced the external chaos of modern urban life. But mainly, and this now seemed ironically naive, I cultivated with almost religious dedication relationships that I believed were genuine and nourishing with people who respected my sharp intelligence, admired my professional competence proven by years of successful projects, and mainly, or so I thought, loved me for who I was, and not for what I could provide materially or emotionally. The visceral, nauseating, absolutely devastating sensation of discovering at that moment, in that suffocating kitchen, through those cold documents, that my own mother, the first person I knew in this world, whose heartbeat was the comforting and constant soundtrack of my first 9 months of existence, whose smell was my first olfactory memory, whose touch was my introduction to the concept of human affection, had tried systematically, methodically, surgically to destroy my mental credibility with the precision of a professional assassin carrying out an execution, was exactly like discovering that the ground on which I had built my entire adult identity, all my certainties about family love and basic trust in the world, every brick of the emotional building that sustained me, was actually treacherous quicksand disguised as solid concrete by a thin layer of cheap varnish that was now dissolving under the crushing and undeniable weight of documented truth. Julia, my dear daughter, my love, you've been looking so tired lately. Those deep, dark circles genuinely worry me. That distant look breaks my mother's heart. Don't you think you should talk to a professional about all this stress that's obviously consuming you? Helen would say frequently during our mandatory weekly dinners on Thursdays, rituals she insisted were sacred to maintain family bonds, but which I now understand were calculated opportunities for observation and manipulation. These dinners were always served in the formal dining room with the impeccable white Irish linen tablecloth that needed to be ironed with military perfection, using the family silverware inherited from my grandmother that Helen obsessively polished until she could see her distorted reflection in the metal. Under the light of the crystal chandelier that my father had bought on a trip to Prague before I was born, She uttered these words always with that specific tone of studied and rehearsed maternal concern that I now understood to be theatrical performance calculated with the precision of a veteran Royal Shakespeare Company actress playing Lady Macbeth, designed specifically, intentionally, maliciously to plant poisonous seeds of doubt about my emotional stability in anyone present as a potential future witness. The domestic staff who served dinner silently could testify in the future about the legitimate concerns of a dedicated mother. The neighbors occasionally strategically invited to create a larger audience would hear about the worrying signs that only attentive maternal eyes could detect. The distant relatives who visited sporadically on holidays would be exposed to carefully constructed narratives about my progressive isolation and personality changes. Each word was chosen with surgical precision to create a consistent, credible, and mainly legally defensible narrative of maternal concern that would be her future protection when she attempted my legal guardianship, when she needed to justify to a judge why a professionally successful daughter needed to have her autonomy revoked and her assets transferred to maternal control. The weight of those cursed documents in my hands, sweaty from the tropical heat and pure adrenaline of traumatic shock, seemed completely disproportionate to the common copy paper on which they were printed. Cheap paper of standard weight that could be bought at any stationery store. Nothing to suggest the epic magnitude of the conspiracy they documented. Nothing to indicate that those apparently innocuous sheets contained evidence of one of the greatest possible betrayals between human beings. There, in that yellowed envelope and those banal sheets, was concrete, irrefutable, documented and verifiable evidence of a maternal betrayal so profound that it excavated holes in the very foundation of human civilization, so calculated that it revealed levels of premeditation bordering on psychopathic, so absolutely contrary to any natural instinct of maternal protection, encoded in our DNA through millions of years of evolution, that it challenged not only my limited personal conception of family love, but the entire social, cultural, religious, and biological construction of what it means to be a mother, of what the sacred bond between the one who gives life and the life that was given means. When Helen finally came home that fateful afternoon, precisely at 5:47 according to her obsessive habit of punctuality, that she religiously maintained as a form of control over the chaos of the world, carrying grocery bags with the logo of the most expensive establishment in the neighborhood, where she made a point of being seen buying organic and imported products that validated her social status, humming carelessly an old song about mothers and eternal love with a naturalness that now seemed obscene, grotesque, blasphemous considering the apocalyptic context of my discovery. I felt as if I were observing through an emotional magnifying glass a dangerous stranger, an imposter masterfully wearing my mother's skin as a disguise, a method actress who had incorporated the role of loving mother so completely that perhaps she had forgotten where the performance ended and the real person began, if there still was a real person under so many layers of pretense. It was surreal to watch her perform the familiar domestic routine, hanging the keys on the wall key holder shaped like a house with the word home engraved in wood, checking the mail with casual attention, adjusting a vase of flowers that was minimally out of place, as if she hadn't spent the last 3 years architecting my psychiatric destruction. I waited patiently, with the studied patience of a predator stalking the exact moment to confront her prey, with the discipline of a samurai awaiting the perfect opening for the decisive blow, while she methodically put away the groceries in their designated places with obsessive precision, the fruits in the imported Bohemian crystal fruit bowl strategically positioned where the afternoon light created prismatic reflections, the dairy products in the brushed stainless steel refrigerator that cost more than a middle-class family's annual salary, the special grains in hermetic jars labeled with perfect calligraphy that looked like they had come from a decorating magazine. I watched as she prepared her usual chamomile tea with the same precise and invariable ritual. Filtered and purified water boiled in the electric kettle with temperature controlled to exactly 200 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 minutes timed precisely on the tomato-shaped timer that played an irritatingly cheerful melody, 1 level teaspoon of certified organic honey from supposedly happy bees. I waited for her to settle into the royal blue velvet armchair in the living room, her undisputed domestic throne since I can remember, the furniture where she presided over our family destinies like an absolutist queen presiding over voiceless subjects. Every second of this calculated wait was an eternity of anxiety, but I needed the moment to be perfect, for her to be completely comfortable and unprepared, to believe she was safe in her own territory when I detonated the truth bomb I had discovered. I wanted to observe with the clinical attention of an entomologist studying a particularly fascinating insect every microfacial expression when the mask fell, every involuntary tic that would reveal genuine emotions under the performance, every body gesture that would expose the real extent of her guilt, and mainly the abyssal, oceanic depth of her capacity for sustained emotional pretense over decades. I needed to see the exact moment when she would realize that the game was over, that her marked cards had been discovered, that the castle of lies she had built with such dedication was about to collapse spectacularly. The transformation on Helen's face when I deliberately, theatrically, with the dramatic precision of a director revealing the climax of their work, placed the documents on the Italian-tempered glass coffee table. The dry and definitive sound of paper hitting glass echoed through the room like a starting shot for our final battle. Like the first dissonant chord of a symphony of family destruction, was instantaneous and revealing like a Venetian carnival mask, falling on the marble floor and shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces, each fragment reflecting a different lie. The warm and practiced maternal smile that she maintained as her default facial configuration froze on her coral-painted lips. A specific shade called Mother's Love that she had religiously worn for decades because my father had once praised it in a moment of romantic carelessness, as if someone had paused a movie on the wrong frame. Her crystalline blue eyes that I had genetically inherited, but thank God not morally widened in poorly disguised panic that desperately struggled to camouflage itself as innocent surprise. Her pupils dilating and contracting rapidly like those of a cornered animal suddenly realizing that the trap had definitively closed, that there was no escape, that the predator had become prey. Most importantly, and this was what confirmed all my suspicions, her hands began to tremble. First, an almost imperceptible tremor in her fingers, then progressing to a visible shake that made her gold rings tinkle softly. These were hands that had signed my civil death sentence. Hands that had transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars to corrupt doctors. Hands that had caressed my face as a child while already planning my future destruction. The silence that followed my theatrical revelation was dense and suffocating, like the air before a devastating tropical storm, charged with static electricity that made the hair on our arms stand up, filled with unverbalized promises of imminent destruction. It was a silence that physically weighed on us, filled only by the ticking of the antique wall clock that had belonged to my paternal grandfather, an honest man who would be horrified to know what his daughter-in-law had become, and now seemed to count the final seconds until the definitive and irreversible implosion of our family relationship. Each tick was a nail being hammered into the coffin of what had once been love between mother and daughter. Each talk a metronomic reminder that time cannot be rewound, that words cannot be unsaid, that betrayals cannot be undone, and that some actions are unforgivable by their very premeditated and cruel nature. Julia, my dear daughter, my love, my life, this is absolutely not what you seem to be thinking. You're interpreting everything wrong through a distorted lens of mistrust that I don't know where it suddenly came from. Please, let me calmly, rationally explain what's really happening here. You're jumping to conclusions from documents taken out of context. She began with a trembling voice that desperately tried to find the perfect tone between maternal authority that had always worked to control me and emotional supplication that could awaken my filial compassion, her hands frantically gesticulating in the air as if she could conjure a plausible explanation out of nothing. Like a magician trying to distract the audience while the trick went wrong and the rabbit died inside the hat. But I interrupted her by raising my hand in a definitive gesture that indicated with crystalline, unmistakable clarity that I wasn't willing to listen to any more elaborate lies, any more sophisticated emotional manipulation, any more gaslighting disguised as maternal concern. After years, decades, being systematically subjected to subtle but constant brainwashing that had almost succeeded in making me doubt my own perception of reality, the reliability of my memories, the validity of my experiences. Helen. I deliberately used her first name instead of calling her mother, a calculated choice to establish emotional distance that I saw register on her face as if I had physically slapped her with full force. Don't insult my intelligence that you yourself always praised when it suited your manipulative purposes. When you needed me to be successful to validate your image as a perfect mother. By trying to deny the obvious and incontestable when I have here in front of me, on this table, contracts signed with your signature that I've known since childhood, when you taught me to write holding my hand, payment receipts originating from your personal bank account that you believed I didn't know about but which I discovered through meticulous investigation, and fraudulent and criminal medical reports that prove unequivocally, without margin for alternative interpretations or creative justifications, that you systematically paid at least 5 different professionals, each with their specific specialty in destroying lives through fabricated diagnoses, to create from scratch a completely fictional psychiatric history about me, your own daughter. Blood of your blood, flesh of your flesh. My voice came out firmer and more controlled than I expected or believed myself capable of at that moment of absolute emotional devastation, each word measured and weighed like evidence in a capital trial, which seemed to surprise not only Helen but also myself with its calculated coldness that ironically mirrored the coldness with which she had planned my destruction for years. Let's go to the documented, verifiable, and incontestable facts, without room for your alternative narratives or creative interpretations. Dr. Marcus Pereira, that psychiatrist with supposedly impeccable reputation who frequently appears in the media as an expert on serious disorders, who writes columns on mental health in respectable newspapers, who lectured on medical ethics at international conferences, received $150,000 in monthly payments, carefully disguised as regular consultations for 18 long months, to produce elaborate, technically impeccable, and absolutely convincing reports, categorically stating that I suffer from severe type 1 bipolar disorder with psychotic features, manic episodes with delusional grandiosity, depressive phases with active suicidal ideation, and progressive cognitive deterioration incompatible with independent living, when I never, at any point in my life, even set foot in his luxurious office in the city's most upscale neighborhood, never breathed the leather and mahogany, scented air of his office, never sat in his analysis chair imported from Vienna. I continued relentlessly, each revelation a precise stab in the fabric of lies she had woven. Dr. Marina Santos, that forensic psychiatrist with impressive credentials from European universities, powerful connections in the judiciary, author of books on mental capacity assessment, received $80,000 in strategically spaced installments to avoid raising banking suspicions to attest with all her professional and academic authority that I have severe borderline personality disorder with self-destructive tendencies, a history of suicide attempts that never occurred, self-harm that doesn't exist, an imminent risk of violent acts against myself or others. Another professional I never met personally, never exchanged a word with, but who apparently knows me intimately through her 15-page reports on letterhead, describing with vivid details behaviors I never exhibited, thoughts I never had, words I never uttered. Do I need to continue listing all the fabricated diagnoses you bought as if they were products in a macabre catalog of psychiatric horrors? Dr. Fernando Albuquerque, schizophrenia specialist, paid to say I have prodromal symptoms of psychosis. Dr. Patricia Mendez, behavioral neurologist, was bribed to state that tests show brain abnormalities compatible with early dementia. Professor Carlos Rodriguez, retired professor, sold his reputation to sign a report saying I present accelerated cognitive decline. All paid with money you probably started embezzling from Dad's company before his body even cooled in the morgue, while we were still pretending to mourn, while you still wore black and cried in public. Each word I uttered seemed to physically hit Helen like stones being methodically thrown against thin glass, creating cracks that spread exponentially, progressively fragmenting the mask of concerned and loving mother she had worn for decades, with the mastery of a consummate actress to hide her true, manipulative, greedy nature. Fundamentally devoid of genuine empathy and capable of cruelties that defy normal human comprehension. She tried to get up from the armchair with movements that simulated senile frailty and physical vulnerability that didn't correspond to her real vitality. Helen practiced Pilates 3 times a week, took daily morning walks, kept herself in better shape than many women 20 years younger. It was clearly a calculated attempt to awaken my protective instinct, probably to try some physical approach that could break my emotional defenses. Perhaps a hug that would be a prison disguised as affection. Perhaps tears that would be emotional chemical weapons of manipulation. Perhaps even a theatrical feint that would force me to help her, and thus reestablish the care dynamic she could exploit. But I immediately stepped away with decisive and firm steps, keeping the coffee table as an insurmountable physical and symbolic barrier between us. A clear demarcation line between victim and perpetrator that I wouldn't allow to be crossed under any circumstances. Don't come near me. Don't dare try to touch me with those hands that signed my civil death sentence. Those hands that typed bank transfers to destroy my life. Those hands that shook the hands of corrupt doctors sealing my condemnation. My voice came out like a whip, cutting and precise. Don't take another step until you completely admit, without subterfuge, without excuses, without attempts at minimization, What you did with absolute premeditation and full awareness of the consequences. And mainly, I need you to explain to me, with all the honesty you're still capable of accessing in your atrophied conscience, why? What motivation could be so powerful, so consuming, so absolutely priority that it would justify in your distorted mind the monstrous decision to systematically destroy the professional reputation I built with years of study and work, the personal autonomy I conquered with sacrifice, and the sanity of the very daughter you brought into the world. Helen sat back down with movements that now revealed her true emotional age, not the confident woman who presided over social dinners, but someone who had been completely and irrevocably unmasked, exposed in her moral nudity. The woman who always maintained an impeccable appearance even on the most casual mornings, who woke up at 6 a.m. to apply makeup before even having coffee, because a lady never presents herself disheveled. With blonde hair perfectly styled in waves that framed her face with mathematical precision, studied in YouTube tutorials, makeup applied with decades of daily practice expertise following the latest contouring and highlighting trends, and elegant clothes that demonstrated the refined taste cultivated during decades of marriage to a successful businessman who had pampered her with expensive gifts, international trips to exclusive destinations, and credit cards without limits. This woman now seemed to have aged a decade in a few minutes. The wrinkles around her eyes that she fought with quarterly Botox seemed deeper, as if they had been excavated by guilt in a matter of seconds. Her normally dewy skin, thanks to expensive aesthetic treatments with unpronounceable French names, seemed to have lost all the artificially maintained collagen. Her always proud shoulders of someone who never needed to bow before anyone now curved under the invisible but crushing weight of her own actions, exposed to the relentless and purifying light of documented truth. Julia, my beloved daughter, my most precious treasure. You need to understand with your heart, not just with your mind that's always so logical and analytical that you inherited from your father, that absolutely everything I did, every decision made in the sleepless early mornings when I worried about your future, every cent spent that you consider wasted, was thinking exclusively about your future well. Being when I'm no longer here to protect you. Helen tried to argue with a forced conviction that sounded as fake as a $3 bill, her voice oscillating between tones that couldn't find the right frequency to penetrate my emotional defenses now fortified by truth. You were so stressed with that job that consumes your life like an emotional vampire, always with impossible deadlines that made you work entire nights. Crushing responsibilities that no woman should carry alone, so distant from the family that always loved you unconditionally. Despite your constant absences, I just wanted to ensure you had adequate professional support to prevent a nervous breakdown that seemed inevitable given the pressure you put on yourself. The titanic audacity of continuing to elaborate increasingly complex lies even when confronted with irrefutable documentary evidence that could criminally convict her left me simultaneously furious at the grotesque insult to my intelligence and morbidly fascinated by the abyssal depth, almost admirable in its consistency, of her ability to distort reality to fit her convenient narratives, as if truth were modeling clay that could be infinitely reshaped at her whim. These highly qualified professionals with years of experience and impeccable reputations assured me with all their medical authority and scientific knowledge that they were just creating strategic preventive documentation, a kind of mental health insurance, in case you really developed problems in the future due to the accumulated stress of years of professional overload. It would be infinitely easier and faster to get adequate treatment without the devastating and inhumane bureaucracy of the health system that leaves people waiting months for care while deteriorating. Preventive documentation? Mental health insurance? My voice rose 2 octaves. Incredulity overflowing like boiling water from a covered pot. You're really, in all seriousness, looking into my eyes that I inherited from you, but that see the truth you deny, trying to convince me that you paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, an amount that could feed entire families for years, finance the education of dozens of underprivileged children, build homes for the homeless, for supposedly ethical professionals to create completely false, fraudulent, and criminal psychiatric diagnoses as a preventive health measure, as if it were a macabre health plan for imaginary mental illnesses you invented yourself. The sarcasm in my voice was so cutting it could slice steel, making Helen visibly shrink in the armchair as if each word were a verbal whip punishing decades of accumulated lies. Let's abandon this pathetic theater of misunderstood mother and talk about what's really happening here. The naked and raw truth without the adornments of your elaborate justifications with the creativity of a science fiction novelist, I said, getting up to get more documents I had strategically separated. You discovered through your contacts at the law firm, probably bribing some desperate secretary with access to confidential files, or perhaps seducing some impressionable intern with your socialite smooth talk. That Dad changed his will 6 months before dying from that heart attack, you always found suspiciously convenient and timely. He left 80% of all assets, including the company he built from scratch with sweat and sacrifice, the 12 properties in upscale neighborhoods that yield fortunes in rent, the diversified investments in stocks and funds that multiply exponentially. Everything directly to me with specific ironclad clauses that prevented you from having any administrative control, not even as a state executor. I continued relentlessly, each revelation a bomb exploding the foundations of her narrative. Dad already suspected your growing greed that manifested in increasingly extravagant spending. Designer bags that cost the equivalent of economy cars, jewelry that could buy apartments first, class trips to resorts where you spent in a week what a family lives on for years. He saw how you financed every absurd whim of Raphael's, every failed business project that was obviously destined for failure from conception. The designer clothing store in a middle-class neighborhood, the vegan restaurant in a city of steakhouses, the pet food delivery startup that never got off the ground, but consumed millions in market research. You desperately needed a legally valid way to contest the ironclad will and assume total control of the fortune built with my father's sweat. So you architected this diabolical plan to turn me into a madwoman in the eyes of justice. Raphael's name seemed to awaken something primitive in Helen, a spark of selective maternal indignation that temporarily replaced the panic in her now opaque blue eyes with fear and guilt. Her lips trembled, her nostrils flared, and for a moment I saw the real Helen, not the performative mother, but the woman who prioritized a parasitic son over a productive daughter. Your brother is not a parasite. She practically spat the words with venom. Raphael is a sensitive and talented young man with an artist's soul who just had fewer opportunities than you, because the world is cruel to creative people who don't fit the traditional capitalist mold. He was always more delicate, more in need of maternal protection. His emotional constitution requires more family support to develop his still unrealized potential. You had everything on a silver platter: natural intelligence, academic ease, professional charisma. Raphael had to fight against anxiety, depression, social misunderstanding. Raphael has always been by your side because you support him financially and emotionally as if he were an eternal baby in need of a bottle, I countered with surgical precision. You transformed him through decades of pathological pampering and total absence of limits into an eternal dependent and manipulative teenager who blindly validates all your manipulations in exchange for financial security and complete absence of adult responsibilities. While I woke up at 5 in the morning to study for college entrance exams, Raphael slept until noon. While I worked unpaid internships to gain experience, Raphael searched for his vocation, traveling through Europe with your credit card. While I built my career brick by brick, Raphael built entrepreneurial sandcastles that you financed knowing they would collapse at the first wave. The raw truth about the sick family dynamic flowed like a broken dam. He knew about your Machiavellian plan from the beginning, didn't he? Every sordid detail, every calculated step. Raphael actively and consciously participated in this criminal conspiracy to declare me insane, probably already calculating with the precision of a corrupt accountant how much of my inheritance would be transferred to him through you. Already planning how he would spend my fortune on imported cars he would drive drunk, hedonistic trips to Ibiza where he would lose himself in drugs and luxury prostitutes, investments in obscure cryptocurrencies that would evaporate like his other projects. Helen's expression, an involuntary contraction of the left eye's orbicular muscle combined with a slight blush on her cheeks that Botox couldn't completely hide, confirmed my suspicions before she even tried to formulate an unconvincing denial. Raphael not only knew, but had probably been the operational brain while Helen was the financier and public face of the conspiracy. He had probably researched which doctors were corruptible, which diagnoses would be most convincing, which legal strategy would be most effective for a quick guardianship. At that dramatic moment of maximum tension, when the air seemed electrified with long, repressed truths, the living room door burst open with theatrical flair, and Raphael entered with the arrogant confidence of a prince entering his kingdom. My brother, wearing a casual Italian designer outfit that probably cost 3 minimum wages, perfectly pressed linen shirt, impeccable tailored pants, leather loafers that shone like mirrors, stopped abruptly upon seeing the compromising documents strategically spread on the table like tarot cards revealing a dark future. His expression went through a cinematic sequence of emotions: initial confusion, gradual recognition, growing panic, and finally a desperate attempt to maintain composure. "What's happening here? What circus is this? Mom, are you okay? Is Julia having another one of her paranoid episodes?" he asked with false concern that couldn't completely hide the nervousness in his voice. He automatically positioned himself beside Helen like an emotional bodyguard, in a theatrical demonstration of loyalty that confirmed his priorities and his complicity. Raphael had always been physically similar to our father. Same athletic build artificially maintained by personal trainers and expensive supplements. Same penetrating blue eyes that in our father transmitted integrity, but in him revealed only moral emptiness and poorly disguised greed. Same square jaw that transmitted authority, but which he used only to intimidate waiters in expensive restaurants. But the resemblance was a cruel genetic irony, as he had never inherited even a fraction of the tireless work ethic or unshakable moral integrity that characterized our father. "Your brother is fine, Raphael. Just as you were perfectly fine and conscious when you actively participated in the secret meetings with the corrupt psychiatrists, our mother generously paid with the family's assets to diagnose me as insane," I said directly, without beating around the bush or preparation, savoring the impact of each word like a sommelier tasting rare wine. "Don't insult my intelligence, which unlike yours had adequate development through study and effort, by pretending surprise or indignation. I found printed emails with your digital signature, WhatsApp messages you forgot to delete, call records to the involved doctors. You suggested specific strategies to make the reports more technically convincing, discussed with surprising knowledge for someone who dropped out of 3 different colleges what would be the best combination of mental illnesses to justify a quick and incontestable legal guardianship." Raphael opened and closed his mouth several times like a goldfish suffocating outside the aquarium of lies where he had always lived, his face alternating between red with anger and white with fear, like a malfunctioning emotional traffic light. He clearly didn't expect me to have discovered such specific documentary evidence of his active and enthusiastic participation in the conspiracy. The mask of concerned and protective brother that he maintained at family events slipped completely like cheap makeup under acid rain, revealing the calculating and amoral opportunist he had always been, but only our father had been perceptive enough to clearly recognize. "Julia, you're completely distorting everything with your characteristic paranoia, misinterpreting normal and legitimate conversations between mother and son about genuine concerns with your visibly deteriorated mental health." Raphael tried gaslighting with the same technique Helen had perfected, but without the emotional sophistication that decades of manipulative maternal practice had given her. It was like watching a cheap cover band trying to imitate the original artist. All of us, the whole family, close friends, even co-workers who prefer not to confront you, have noticed your dramatic behavior changes in recent years. Your progressive and worrying isolation from everyone who genuinely loves you. Your sick and unbalanced obsession with work that's clearly an escape from unresolved emotional issues. Your consistently failed relationships that follow an obvious pattern of self-sabotage rooted in childhood traumas you refuse to admit. Each word was an insult to my intelligence, but also a revelation about how deeply they had planned this narrative. Behavior changes like establishing healthy boundaries with toxic relatives who suck me dry emotionally and financially. Progressive isolation like no longer participating in hellish dinners where you two constantly criticized me with fake smiles, systematically undermined my self-esteem with surgically precise comments disguised as concern, made me feel inadequate despite all my achievements. Sick obsession with work like building a brilliant career through my own merit while you at 40 still ask mom for money to fill up the car. My voice gained strength and conviction. And as for my failed relationships that you mention with such falsified fraternal concern, let's talk honestly about how you and Helen systematically sabotaged every person who showed genuine interest in me. Remember Miguel, the architect I met at the conference? You spread rumors that I had violent outbursts. Marina, the doctor I dated for 2 years? Helen sought her out, concerned about my non-existent family history of mental illness. Ricardo, my ex-husband who genuinely loved me, you gradually convinced him that I needed psychiatric medication, planted so many seeds of doubt that he started seeing illness where there was only humanity. Raphael tried to physically approach with steps that simulated casualness, but hid subliminal threat, using his physical superiority as he had done since childhood, when he pushed me, pinched me, pulled my hair, and then denied everything to our parents. But I was no longer the defenseless child he terrorized. I stood up from the couch with fluid and confident movement, maintaining strategic distance, my body posture clearly communicating that any attempt at approach would be interpreted as aggression and responded to accordingly. Don't dare approach me, Raphael, neither you nor Helen. You both definitively and irrevocably lost any right to physical or emotional proximity when you consciously decided to turn me into a financial exploitation project, a chess piece in a sick game where my sanity was the prize. I declared with firmness that clearly surprised him. I want you to know formally that in addition to the criminal legal measures I'm taking, and yes, that includes formal criminal complaint that will be filed tomorrow at 8 in the morning, I will also request an emergency judicial restraining order against both of you. I don't want you within 300 feet of me, my residence whose address you don't know, my workplace, which is my professional sanctuary, or any space where I am. Helen let out a dramatic groan that seemed to have been rehearsed for Mexican soap operas, bringing her hand to her chest in a performance of wounded mother that would have drawn tears from an uninformed audience. Julia, my daughter, blood of my blood, how can you do this to your family? We are your only true bonds in this cruel world. We can resolve our misunderstandings with genuine family therapy. We can rebuild the burned bridges. We can forgive and move forward as a family. Family therapy? I almost laughed, but maintained my composure. With therapists, you would choose and pay to validate your narratives. With professionals, you must have already mapped as corruptible. You perverted the sacred concept of psychological help, turned it into a weapon of destruction. Do you know how many years? Decades, perhaps? I'll need genuine therapy to process the trauma of discovering that my own mother paid fortunes to make me believe I was crazy. The psychological damage you caused by making me question every memory, every perception, every feeling as potentially false. It was at that crucial moment that my cell phone rang with the specific ringtone I had designated for urgent professional calls. It was Dr. Fernanda Costa, my lawyer. I answered on speakerphone deliberately. Yes, Dr. Fernanda. I'm with them right now. Exactly, I have all the evidence. Understood, we'll file the criminal complaint tomorrow morning. About the restraining order? Perfect. And the account freeze? Excellent. After hanging up, I turned to them with barely disguised satisfaction. Justice will be swift. Precautionary freezing of all your bank accounts will be requested as a protective measure, since there's evidence of using embezzled resources from the inheritance to finance crimes. You have 24 hours to hire lawyers. I suggest they be good ones. Raphael went livid hearing about account freezing. Without access to Helen's money, he was nothing. A 40-year-old man without profession, without savings, without prospects. Helen stood up abruptly, the veneer of victim dissolving into pure rage. You're an aberration, Julia. You always were strange, cold, incapable of normal love. Your father would be disgusted. I always knew there was something wrong with you, something broken, something rotten. Fascinating, I observed clinically, how you went from all for love to personal attacks when you realized you lost control. This confirms there was never genuine love, only manipulation and greed. I walked toward the door, but stopped for one last revelation. Dad left letters in the bank safe. He wrote about you, Helen. About your transformation after the money grew. About your guardianship plans he discovered 2 years before dying. He changed the will specifically to protect me from you. The silence that followed was sepulchral. Helen seemed to have aged decades in seconds, the truth that her own husband had seen through her being the final blow. He wrote, I recited from memory, Helen has changed. Greed has consumed her. Raphael is lost to her influence. I need to protect Julia because Helen will destroy her for money if she can. At that moment, we heard sirens approaching. I forgot to mention, I said with satisfaction. Dr. Fernanda obtained an immediate search and seizure warrant. The police and medical board are arriving. Panic took over both of them. Helen ran toward the office, probably to destroy evidence, but it was too late. The officers were already entering, professional and impersonal. Mrs. Helen Martins, we have a court order to seize all documents and electronic devices. The medical board also arrived. Dr. Roberto Lima introduced himself. The doctors involved will face permanent license revocation. Creating false reports is an extremely serious crime. There are other victims. This is bigger than we imagined. While the search proceeded, boxes of documents being cataloged, computers seized, even old agendas collected, I made my final statement. This could have been avoided if you had genuinely loved me. Every action today is legitimate defense against crimes you committed. You destroyed this family the moment you chose money over love, greed over blood. Please, Julia. Helen tried one last time. Tears. I don't know if they were genuine running down her face. I am your mother. That has to mean something. It meant everything, I replied. Until you decided my sanity was worth less than my inheritance. Dad would be proud to see me defending myself from you. I turned to leave but paused. True family protects. True family celebrates others' successes. True family loves unconditionally. You were never my true family. I left the house where I had grown up, each step physically and emotionally distancing me from that nightmare. The sun was setting, painting the sky in dramatic tones that seemed appropriate for the end of an era. In the car, I finally allowed the tears to fall, not of sadness, but of relief. I was free. During the period of emotional recovery that followed the trial, I dove deeply into intensive therapy with Dr. Beatrice, meeting twice a week in sessions that sometimes extended for 3 hours when we touched on particularly painful memories or especially disturbing revelations about patterns of abuse that dated back to my early childhood. Her office became my sanctuary of psychic reconstruction, a sacred space where I could dismantle piece by piece the distorted architecture of reality that Helen had built in my mind over decades, and rebuild a solid understanding of who I was beyond the poisonous narratives that had been planted like landmines in my psyche. The trauma of discovering that your own mother systematically tried to destroy your mental sanity for financial motivation is comparable in intensity to psychological torture used in war contexts. Beatrice explained to me during a particularly intense session on an autumn afternoon when golden leaves fell from the oak tree outside the window like nature's tears. You're not just processing a singular betrayal, but rebuilding your fundamental understanding of basic concepts like love, family, trust, and the very nature of reality. When the person who should be your anchor of safety in the world reveals herself as the architect of your destruction, the entire psychological building needs to be rebuilt from the foundations. An unexpected but deeply significant development was the spontaneous creation of a support group for victims of family psychological abuse, especially focused on cases where family members had tried to weaponize the mental health system as a tool of control, exploitation, or punishment. The group started informally when 3 other victims of Dr. Marcus Pereira sought me out after the media coverage, looking for someone who understood the unique and devastating experience of having one's sanity questioned by those who should protect it. We initially met in the empty conference room of a community center on Wednesday nights, a small circle of survivors sharing stories that seemed like dystopian fiction but were painfully real. My husband paid 3 psychiatrists to say I had delusional disorder to get full custody of our children, shared Maria, a 50-year-old teacher whose hands trembled holding the reheated coffee cup from the community center. During the divorce, every time I contested the division of assets or asked for adequate alimony, he presented a new report saying I was paranoid, aggressive, incapable of caring for children. I lost everything: house, children, dignity. The worst part is, I started to believe it. If so many doctors said I was crazy, maybe I really was. 2 years after the conviction, on a spring morning when the purple jacarandas painted the city with their ephemeral flowers, I received a letter from Helen from the State Women's Penitentiary. The institutional white envelope with the prison system stamp arrived along with the usual bills and advertisements, but its emotional weight was disproportionate to its physical presence. I stared at it for hours before opening it, internally debating whether I should read or burn it unopened, whether knowing its contents would be therapeutic progress or traumatic regression. The letter was long, 12 pages of lined paper filled with the handwriting I recognized from childhood, the same writing that wrote loving notes in my school lunchbox and now tried to rewrite history to position herself as a misunderstood victim. "Dear Julia," it began, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't tried to destroy me. "Prison has given me infinite time to reflect on my mistakes, but you need to understand that everything I did came from a place of love distorted by a mother's desperation seeing her children in conflict." I read the entire letter once, mentally cataloging each manipulation technique employed. Minimization, small errors in judgment. Projection, your coldness forced me to extreme measures. Gaslighting, you always misinterpreted my intentions. Victimization, I'm suffering more than you. Emotional blackmail, I could die here without your forgiveness. And false promises, we can start over when I get out. It was a compendium of narcissistic abuse. A masterclass in manipulation that would have worked years ago, but now only confirmed that she was incapable of genuine change. My response was brief, definitive, sent through my lawyer to maintain legal and emotional barriers. "Helen, I received your letter, but do not wish to maintain correspondence. Your actions were premeditated crimes, not errors of love. Your motivation was financial greed, not maternal concern. Your sentence is legal consequence, not injustice. Do not seek contact again. Go on with your life as I am going on with mine, separately and permanently. This is my last communication. Raphael tried to contact me dozens of times after his conditional release 2 years later, always through intermediaries since the restraining order remained valid and would be permanently valid by judicial decision. His messages predictably varied between melodramatic emotional appeals about blood bonds that don't break and veiled threats about social consequences of destroying the family and karma that returns to ungrateful daughters. Each attempt was meticulously documented and reported to authorities, creating a dossier that could result in revocation of parole if he persisted. The reconstruction of my professional life after the initial scandal was surprisingly positive, completely contradicting Raphael's catastrophic predictions about social ostracism and career destruction. Many important clients expressed not only understanding but admiration for the courage to confront family crimes in a country where dirty laundry is washed at home is still an unwritten cultural commandment. Your integrity in seeking justice, even against your own family, demonstrates exactly the type of professional ethics we want in our partners, said the CEO of a multinational construction company during a meeting where we closed a $50 million contract for a new hospital complex. 3 years after the trial, in a decision that surprised even myself, I decided to use a substantial part of my father's inheritance to establish the Paul Martins Foundation for Victims of Family Psychological Abuse. Named in honor of the man who had tried to protect me even after death through a carefully shielded will, the foundation offered free legal assistance with specialized lawyers, psychological support with therapists trained in family trauma, and mainly validation for people who were being systematically gaslighted by their own families. The foundation's office occupied 3 floors of a historic building downtown that I completely renovated, transforming the once deteriorated space into a welcoming but professional environment. Treatment rooms in calming neutral tones, library with literature on psychological abuse and recovery, meeting room for support groups, even a children's space so victims could attend without worrying about children. Every detail thought out by someone who viscerally understood the needs of those seeking help. One of the most impactful cases the foundation supported was Ana Paula, a 23-year-old whose ultra-religious parents were trying to forcibly commit her for her sexual orientation. Using fabricated diagnoses of sexual identity disorder and deviant behavior created by psychiatrists who shared the parents' religious fundamentalism, they had obtained a preliminary court order for commitment. Our team worked frantically, obtaining a suspensive injunction hours before the forced hospitalization. "You literally saved my life," Ana Paula told me crying after the definitive judicial victory that not only prevented the commitment, but resulted in criminal proceedings against the doctors involved. I was starting to believe I was really sick for loving women, that I needed to be cured of my identity. The pressure was so constant, so absolute, that I began to doubt myself. You gave me back not just my freedom, but my sanity, my certainty that there's nothing wrong with me. During a lecture on family psychological manipulation that I gave at the Federal University's psychology department, auditorium packed with students and professionals, a young woman raised her hand during the question session. "Have you forgiven your mother?" The question, though expected at every lecture, always made me pause and reflect on the complex meaning of forgiveness in context of systematic and premeditated abuse. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation or forgetting, I answered carefully, weighing each word. I released the anger that was consuming me because it was harming me more than the perpetrators. Carrying hatred is like drinking poison expecting the other to die. But forgiving doesn't mean allowing toxic people back into your life or minimizing the gravity of crimes. Forgiveness, for me, means moving forward without the weight of hatred, but also without the naivety of believing that fundamentally broken people can be fixed with just love and patience. It's accepting that some people are incapable of genuine love, and that it's okay to maintain permanent distance from them. The most shocking discovery came 3 years after the trial, when deeper investigation of financial records ordered by the IRS revealed that Helen had started embezzling money from my college savings account when I was just 16. Using falsified documents with my teenage signature that she had practiced copying, she had systematically diverted small amounts totaling almost $100,000 over 2 decades. The pattern of financial exploitation had begun when I was a minor, intertwined with psychological conditioning that prepared me to accept increasingly larger violations. 5 years after the initial discovery of the conspiracy, I received through official channels the news that Helen had been diagnosed with advanced stage pancreatic cancer during a routine examination in the penitentiary infirmary. The information came accompanied by a formal request for authorization for humanitarian house arrest based on need for palliative care that the prison system claimed couldn't adequately provide. I spent weeks agonizing over how to respond, consulting Beatrice, close friends, even spiritual leaders about the moral dilemma of maintaining distance from a dying mother who had tried to destroy me. My final response was pragmatic and firm. I wouldn't oppose house arrest for basic humanitarian reasons, recognizing that denying adequate medical care would make me cruel in a way that contradicted my fundamental values. However, I would maintain all restraining orders in effect, and there would be no contact or reconciliation. Illness doesn't erase crimes, I wrote in the official document. Physical suffering doesn't absolve emotional cruelty. Proximity to death doesn't rewrite the past or create obligation for forced forgiveness. Helen died 6 years after her conviction, on a gray winter afternoon, alone except for Raphael in the modest apartment where she served electronically monitored house arrest. The news came by official email from the Justice Department. Bureaucratic communication informing of the death of convict Helen Martins and mentioning there were testamentary provisions including me. This time, I didn't open the letter she left. I instructed my lawyer to permanently file it unread, a decision that represented my emotional growth and definitive refusal to allow Helen any power over my mental peace, even posthumously. The funeral was small and melancholy, attended by Raphael, some distant acquaintances, and surprisingly, 2 other victims of Dr. Marcus who came to pay respects to the end of an era. I didn't attend, choosing to spend the day creating positive memories with people who genuinely loved me. Some judged my absence as cruel, but I had learned that establishing healthy boundaries wasn't cruelty. It was necessary survival. Years later, I can finally say I found genuine peace and even gratitude for the journey. Not gratitude for the abuse, that would be masochism, but for the strength discovered, for the wonderful people who entered my life, for the opportunity to transform trauma into positive social change. The Paul Martins Foundation now operates nationally, has helped hundreds of victims, influenced legislation, changed medical protocols. Today, at 43, I lead a full and meaningful life. My engineering company thrives with projects that improve lives. I have a healthy relationship built on radical honesty with someone who understands that some scars never completely disappear. I wake up every morning with absolute certainty that my sanity and worth don't depend on validation from people unworthy of trust. The deepest lesson I learned is that family isn't defined by blood, but by people who consistently choose our well-being above their interests. The family I consciously built, loyal friends, colleagues who became siblings, survivors who became warriors by my side, demonstrated more love in a few years than Helen in decades. Blood may be thicker than water, I wrote in the last chapter of my book that became a bestseller and academic reference, but poison is thicker than blood. When family becomes a source of destruction instead of protection, we have not only the right but the responsibility to choose our survival. It's not coldness. Did you enjoy Julia's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.